Welcome everyone to our webinar, part of the Foundations Academy. And this will be our last session for this year, but we have some exciting things coming up next year that Kim will tell you about later on. Let's begin with a prayer. Let us pray. Oh God, we give you thanks for this day and this time together. We thank you for Grace and her willingness to lend her expertise to our conference. And we thank you for each person who has given of their time this evening, because they recognize that the ministry that they're involved in is crucial for the community. And so that funding it becomes their top priority this evening. Be with us as we listen and learn and put to use what we hear this evening. We pray in your Son's name. Amen. Well, my name is Jeff Taylor. I'm the president of the United Methodist Foundation, and with me are Kim Matthews. She's our vice president. You probably know Kim. And our special guest speaker, Grace Duddy Pomroy. And part of the foundation's mission is to create a culture of generosity. And one of the ways we do that is by providing a series of webinars and live seminars to provide education in the broad area of stewardship. So tonight, we're glad to welcome back to Almost Heaven, Grace Duddy Pomroy. Grace is the director of Stewardship Leaders Program at Luther Seminary. She's a stewardship leader, speaker, and financial educator. She is the co-author of the stewardship book, Embracing Stewardship: How to Put Stewardship at the Heart of Your Congregation's Life. And she's the author of Stewards of God's Love, which is a stewardship resource for the evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I encourage you to read Grace's blog, which you can find at www.gracepomroy.com. That'll be in the chat in a little while, so you can click on that. Where on that blog, she helps couples transform their relationship and deepen their intimacy by having an open and honest conversation about money. Grace is joining us tonight from her new home in Gig Harbor. I should have asked you, Grace, did I get that right? Gig Harbor, Washington. So we have a lot of geography covered tonight, and we welcome you, Grace, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that kind introduction. It is absolutely wonderful to be back with this group again. I've had such great experiences presenting here in the past and look forward to the questions that you might have. My goal for this evening, or this afternoon in the case of my time zone, is to give this presentation enough time to give you some idea of what I'm talking about, and then also to give plenty of time for Q&A. So I really do encourage you to put questions in the chat, to put questions in that Q&A box. We will have time for polls. I would love to hear from you so we can have a rich conversation together near the end of our time. And without further ado, I will dig into our content. So first, I want to start out by sharing, how did we get here to we're at a point where we have to actually talk about funding the church of today and tomorrow? Where exactly did this problem come from? And part of my role at Luther Seminary is teaching a class on funding forward. And one of the first things that I like to share in that class is a TED Talk by someone named Michelle Wucker, and it's called Why We Ignore Obvious Problems and How to Act on Them. It's a brilliant TED Talk, and it's less than 10 minutes long. I thoroughly encourage you to check it out. And one of the concepts that Michelle talks about is something called gray rhinos. Now, gray rhinos are problems that are charging right at us. Everyone in the room can see them, but no one wants to talk about that problem. No one wants to talk about that gray rhino, and yet we can all see it. And for me, I think one of the gray rhinos in the church today is that for many faith communities, it has or will become less and less feasible to fund their missions on tithes and offerings alone. Again, this isn't a circumstance for every congregation, but I think many faith communities, especially since the pandemic, are facing this issue that covering their missions just on tithes and offerings is becoming less feasible. So you might wonder, how exactly did we get to this point? How did we get to this place? I want to share with you a little bit of data, and I promise if you're not a data person, I will walk you through it, and it will just be a couple of minutes, so bear with me. To begin with, I want to share the data that's most often pointed to. This is from the Pew Research Center, focusing on the rise of those who are religiously unaffiliated. In other words, the rise of the nones, so to speak. And as you can see on the top of the chart, we also see the decline in those who are affiliating themselves as Christian. But I think what makes this even more interesting is as we look across the generations. Looking across the generations, we see a rise in those who are considering themselves unaffiliated. Oftentimes, and I'm sure you've seen headlines just as I have, of people throwing millennials or Gen Zers, which is the generation after millennials, under the bus, saying they are the ones who caused this crisis of people who are unaffiliated. However, as you can see, this is a trend that's gone across the board, across these different generations. It's not a new phenomenon, so to speak. But as we look down, what's even more interesting, I think, is looking at the percentage of adults who say they attend religious services. As we look across the generations, we see that those who are attending on a weekly basis is going down. That's that dark blue category on the side there. We see that going down. We see a slight increase in those who are going once or twice a month, and an even bigger increase in those who are attending a few times a year and seldomly, and even some increase in those who are never attending. Now, you might say, Grace, what exactly does this have to do with church funding, and how does this generational piece impact membership and attendance? Well, coming into this webinar, I decided to do a deep dive into United Methodist Church data. And for a data nerd like me, I had a full feast. I just rolled up to that buffet table. I was so excited for it. And I found some interesting data focusing specifically on the West Virginia Conference here today. And I took a look at what I could find in terms of membership and attendance numbers from 2011 to 2020. So just bear in mind, there's not a lot of pandemic impact that we're going to be seeing in these numbers. But I still think it shows off that trend. As we look in that red part at the beginning, that's membership. From 2011 to 2020, we see a pretty clear line of decline down. Now, if we look at any individual years, that's not much, but again, we can see that trend line. Looking at the attendance numbers down at the bottom, that one's a little bit more jagged, but again, we can still see that through line of attendance. But of course, if you're anything like me, as you're looking at this, you're like, yes, I can see a decline, but it's not a precipitous decrease. It's not as if we're falling off a cliff, so to speak. Now, I haven't been looking at the chat and Q&A quite yet, but I do just want to say, I know this is a lot to take a look at, and you might want to be taking like a lot of notes, scribbling those down. Please do know that I've given a link to my presentation to Kim and Jeff to share with you, so you will be able to review that later if that's what you might be interested in. But going back to the data, again, just looking at the numbers across the board, we're seeing that small decline. But I want to bring you into some ELCA numbers. That's the tradition that I'm a part of, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. We're also seeing that trend line of decline. And I didn't see this same data that was replicated by the United Methodist, so I hope you'll excuse me bringing you into my tradition here. But back in 2017, those who were in the ELCA Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation decided to see some projections outward. If they took that small decline, what would it look like if all variables stayed the same and the same decline was happening if we looked out to 2033 and 2050? And as you can see from looking at the numbers here, in 2017, there were 3.4 million baptized members in the ELCA. Moving down to 2033, that went down to 1.8. And then at 2050, we're down to 66,000 members. Now, you might say, Grace, that's all well and good. I understand that. I may have seen that decline in my congregation, and I've certainly seen the decline talking to family and friends who are Christians. But how does this bear out on a congregation's finances? Let's dive into the data from the National Study of Congregations' Economic Practices. This is from the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, and it's one of the most comprehensive studies that's out there on congregational funding across denominational lines. So they took a look at the percentage of congregations' revenue, percentage of the budget, that comes from various sources. And what they found is that across these different congregations, 81% came from individual donations. And of course, some had rental income, some had endowment income, some had denominational funding, and some had special fundraisers. But for the most part, most of that funding is coming from individual donations. Taking a look even further, we see that 40% of congregations receive essentially their entire annual revenue from individual donations. So that's almost half of the congregations studied are receiving 100% from individual donations. And most of these individual donations are coming in during the worship service through the offering plate. Now, of course, we know that during the pandemic, there was a rise in online giving, and that trend continues. However, a lot of this is still based on the idea that the people who are members or attenders, and mainly the attenders of the congregations, are the ones who are giving, and they are the ones who are funding the budget. And again, if we're seeing that trend line of decline, it's becoming less and less feasible that tithes and offerings can be that only funding source. I realize this is a lot of hard data to start the conversation with, and you may be really chewing down on that chocolate bar out of nervousness and anxiety for this data. And I get where you're coming from. But I really would encourage you to take a step back, take a balcony view with me. How might we see this not just as a challenge, but an opportunity? And before we jump into that opportunity side of things, I want to do a quick poll. So Kim, I'm wondering if you can help me out. I would love to know, in your congregation specifically, what is the percentage of the congregation's budget that's coming just from individual donations? And these would be from people in the congregation. Give you a second to vote on that. I look forward to seeing what you come up with. I'm excited to see if your data bears up or stands up against that National Study of Economic Practices. So I think whenever you're ready, Kim, we can close that poll, and I'll see if I'm able to see those poll results, and I'm able to share those with the group. Oh, wow, there we go. 95+%. Those of you on the webinar, most of you are in that 95+%. Then we have some folks in the 80% plus. So again, that's consistent with the findings of the National Study of Economic Practices. And we have one that was solo down in that 40% plus. And I'd love to hear more about that when we get to our Q&A time. So thank you so much for sharing. Just helps us to see who's in the room and how these different pieces and parts are working for you. But as I said, I think that we have a choice in how we approach this challenge. We can bury our heads in the sand, or we can begin to see this as an opportunity. And that's what I want to talk with you about next. So taking a look at the opportunity side of things, I feel like this is a moment where we can actually turn back and really listen closely to what God is calling us to do and to be. For many of the congregations that I work with, many of them are ELCA, so maybe the United Methodists don't have this issue. They often don't know what their mission is, besides sustaining their building and sustaining their community. Unbeknownst to them, that has become their mission. They might have a beautiful theological or biblical mission statement that's embroidered up on a wall, but ultimately, it doesn't actually speak to what God is calling the congregation to do and to be. This is an opportunity to discern, where is God calling us next? We've reached this kind of point of change. Similarly, I think when we're in these points of scarcity, where we realize we have less to work with to fund the big mission that God has placed in our midst, it's easy to turn in on ourselves, to focus on what we don't have rather than what we do. And yet, as I've looked across these congregations and ministries who have done this work with my students and I have done over 30 case studies on congregations who've done this work, and we're currently involved in a large-scale research project studying over 200 congregations who have done this work. Connecting with the neighborhood matters. It's easy to turn in on ourselves, but connecting with our neighborhood allows us to find new partnerships. And it also allows us to diversify our income streams. A lot of congregations struggled in the midst of the pandemic because they had only funded their congregation one way, through checks and cash and the offering plate. And they realized in the midst of the pandemic that they not only needed to find another way to give, but that diversifying their income streams and diversifying even the ways they accepted the offering gave them a little more stability against the unexpected. So now I'd like to share with you what Funding Forward is all about. Now, I should note that Funding Forward is a term that was made up by me and my predecessor, Reverend Dr. Adam Copeland at Luther Seminary. So if you look it up, there's not any specific biblical or theological language to this. It's just an idea that we created to tell folks that this is about finding more sustainable economic models for ministry that emerge organically from the organization's mission. This is not just about sustaining an institution. This is about finding the places where money and mission meet. Now, when I started at Luther Seminary in this role in March of 2020, quite an interesting time to start in a new role, I was tasked with researching this subject. My predecessor had put the idea together. He had kind of laid the foundation, but I really needed to put legs on this project. And so I was determined to find a pattern. I wanted to find one, maybe two patterns for how any congregation could find a more sustainable model. I wanted to find the unique recipe. And yet, as I've been studying these different contexts, I have found that this work is anything but cookie cutter. I wish I could come to you today and say, great, if you just repurpose your property and get some grants, you will find a sustainable process. But that's not how this works. I can't give you a cookie cutter or two to make this happen. Instead, I like to tell my students that it's like walking into a bakery. There are so many different forms of baked goods in a good bakery. You'd find a baguette, you might find a sourdough boule, you might find a pretzel, you might find a pain au chocolat. The thing that ties a lot of these baked goods together is the yeast. That's what allows it to grow. That's what allows that baked good to really come alive. But the different baked goods take different shapes because they have different assets that they're working with. Some have different ingredients. Some are put in different temperatures and climate zones. It all creates different results because Funding Forward is about focusing in on what God is calling your congregation uniquely to do and to be, and focusing on the community that you are called to serve, which again is going to produce different ways of handling your money as a result. So what does this process look like? How exactly does it work? Again, we're still learning about this. I've been studying this now for over 2 years, and I found out a lot, but in this research project, we're hoping to find out even more, and I'll be sharing more with you about that a little bit later on. The first piece of this process involves listening to the neighborhood and listening to those in our congregation. So often when we're in a mindset of scarcity, we want to preserve, and our listening ears tend to go away. But what if we take a moment to stop, to take a breath, and to listen? What is God up to? Where do we see signs of love and hope in our community? And how do we discern what God is up to? Really taking that moment to discern a mission statement that anyone could share. Even a 6th grader could share the mission of the congregation, and they could share it in a quick elevator speech with someone who had never met someone from your congregation. What would that look like? How would we get there? And then take a moment to realign the budget. Right now, I'm teaching a course at the seminary called Money and the Mission of the Church. And in that course, I have my students read a book called Money and Ministry by Philip and Janet Jameson. Just wonderful, wonderful ministry leaders. I thoroughly encourage you to check out the book if you haven't had a chance to read it. And in that book, they open up their budgeting chapter by saying that a budget is a statement of faith. It's a statement of faith. What does that mean? Is your budget a statement of faith in your congregation? And have you taken that step to ask the Luke 12 question, that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also? Where is your church's budget taking the heart of your congregation? And how might you realign that? Here's some ideas for budget realignment that I've seen congregations try as they're living into this idea of Funding Forward. First, I've seen them stop or reduce programs that served so well in the past, but are no longer a fit for the mission God is calling that congregation into. I've seen congregations reconsider staffing to say, Are we called to lift up more lay leadership? Are we in a place where we still need a full-time pastor? Might we write in a bivocational minister, a part-time minister, a person who is willing to do gig staffing or contract work? The reason why I bring this up is because oftentimes when we stop reduced programs or we bring in bivocational ministry or part-time ministry, it's because we don't have any other choice. That's the only way we can meet the budget. And we often go through a process of grieving that we don't have a full-time minister or we don't have those programs anymore. This is a little bit different here. This is a missional choice. The mission is guiding these decisions. It might have positive financial ramifications, but the primary reason we're doing this is the mission. The other piece that I would bring to their attention, which often isn't thought about in the church, is allowing ministries to be self-sustaining. I think oftentimes church ministries are not built with any business sensibility, and there are ways that a ministry can become self-sustaining, but because the congregation is so excited about funding it, it doesn't ever look into those opportunities. So for instance, a food pantry could easily be run by donations from the outside community. It could also be that grocery stores are donating food and that volunteers would be volunteering their time to stock the shelves. Thinking about how a ministry might become self-sustaining can relieve pressure on the budget and allow that ministry to live even deeper into its mission. Another part of the puzzle is generating new income sources. Now, there is a cornucopia of ways that you can generate new income sources, and the 200 congregations in our study certainly have a lot of ideas that I can't discuss here. So I'm just going to scratch the surface. One of the things that you might do is repurpose church property. This is probably one of the most basic but also well-used ideas, is to repurpose a church space and allow it to be available for rental. The next piece of the puzzle is monetizing existing services. This one can be a little confusing, so I'm going to give an example here. Let's say in your congregation, you discern that God is calling you to focus on fellowship. Focus on fellowship. That's a key part of your mission. So you want to make sure that coffee hour after your church service is a vibrant space. But you're realizing that many people are leaving early because they didn't have time to get breakfast for their family. So they need to go out to brunch. What would happen if you decided to sell breakfast sandwiches during that hour? So you not only were potentially bringing in income for the church or creating a self-sustaining ministry, so it didn't impact the church's budget and may even added to the church's budget, but it also allows you to live deeper into your mission because people are able to stay longer and really connect with one another in a new way. You might opt for crowdfunding. If you haven't heard of crowdfunding before, it's soliciting micro gifts for a macro impact. Oftentimes, this is mediated, at least in our day and age, through things like Kickstarter or GoFundMe, those different websites that are set up to handle crowdfunding. However, it can also be done through other means, and crowdfunding has been done for centuries before this. As an example, you might remember that during Hurricane Katrina, shortly after Hurricane Katrina happened, there was an invitation and a concert that happened on TV, and everyone was invited to text in a gift of $10. Now, $10 isn't a huge gift, but because millions and millions of people watched this concert and texted in their $10, an enormous impact was able to happen. Another way that you might bring in extra money is through grants. Now, oftentimes congregations say, I'm not eligible for grants. We are a faith-based organization. And I thought that when I started at Luther as well. But as I've dug deeper into this, there are nonprofits, there are foundations, there are denominational organizations, there are parachurch organizations that give grants. And sometimes congregations are even eligible for government funding, particularly at the local level. Social enterprise. You might start a business that also has a mission fuel behind it. And of course, outward focused fundraising models. So instead of just focusing on people in the pews, the membership and attendees is the one who you are fundraising from, might you bring in people from the outside community who are passionate about certain projects, who may never darken the doors of the congregation, who might fund this ministry. Now, at this point, I want to do another two sets of polls. So there'll be two questions here asking about your openness or your congregation's openness to generating income and what you've done so far with budget realignment. So Kim, feel free to put those polls up. I'm excited to see what folks have to say.
I'm working on it. Just hang on.
You're fine, Kim. You're fine, Kim. I'm going to go to my next point, and then you pop up that poll whenever it's ready. So the last piece of this puzzle that's often forgotten is as we're thinking about forward funding, we also have to look at repairing the past. And we'll talk about that in just a moment once you finish the polls. Now, I realize the word consider might throw some of you off. I would just encourage you to give your best guesstimation. You will not be held in any way to the answers you've shared. We will not be able to link you back with these answers, so don't worry about that.
Looks like responding has slowed down, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Is that okay?
That's great. Thank you very much. Wonderful. And thanks so much, Kim, for making that work. I just now am seeing that I can launch polls on my side. I didn't realize that I could. So thank you for running those. So looking at question number 1, has your church considered reducing its budget to better align with its mission? And it looks like almost half of you in the room have considered this. A little less than half have not, and some are kind of in the middle. And would your church consider adding income sources outside the offering plate? It looks like we're open to this in a yes or maybe way, except for maybe one that's stuck in the no category. So I'd love to hear more about what you've considered or what you might think about for the future in our Q&A. And don't worry, if you're at this point thinking this is still pretty fuzzy to me, I will give you plenty of examples for you to grab onto. So taking a look back at the idea of repairing the past, as Funding Forward says, we're moving forward into a new reality, but often that's challenging to do if we haven't done our work of repairing. And that can come in many different forms. In some cases, it's doing specific reparations to communities that might have been injured throughout church history or throughout our church's specific history. Sometimes it also takes the form of doing some repair internally, not just talking about building repairs, but sometimes congregations have been, for instance, borrowing money from their endowments in ways they shouldn't. So repair work might need to happen in order to get ourselves back to a stable place where we can really look forward into the future funding work. Now, I realize that many of you who are astute in this conversation may be saying, Grace, this is all well and good, but honestly, this doesn't sound like anything fresh and new. And if you're saying that, you are absolutely right. There is nothing new about what I'm sharing here. If you look through the Bible, if you look through church history, there are a variety of examples of different economic models that congregations and the church in general has used over time to thrive. So honestly, it's only been for the past century or so that the American church has been so stuck on the offering plate being the only way to fund its mission. The other thing that I want to make sure to note here is that congregations throughout time have been doing this work, but particularly over the last couple of decades, a lot of our communities, a lot of our congregations who are marginalized and in underrepresented areas and serving people of lower socioeconomic statuses have had to do this work. There was no way they were going to be able to fund their mission on tithes and offerings alone, so they had to go outside the offering plate. And while I can't speak to the United Methodist experience, I can say in the ELCA and other mainline denominations, generally the people who are entrepreneurial in this way have been shunned or looked down upon or turned away or seen as less than because their community could not fund itself by tithes and offerings alone. The reason why I bring this up is because of the stereotypes that were put against these communities, but also to say that this work is building upon the beautiful and rich work that these communities have done to pave the way forward. And I look forward to sharing some of their work with you. And the last thing that I want to share is you might say, Grace, there's a lot of ideas out there for generating income and even for reducing our budget. How do we figure out what is right for us? And I want to share with you a tool from my colleague in ministry, Mark Elston. He wrote this for Rooted Good and also used it as a part of his book, We Aren't Broke. And I'll share with you more about his ministry here in just a few minutes. But I wanted to draw your attention to this matrix. How do we begin to make these money and ministry decisions so that money doesn't take over the mission element of this? So taking a look at this diagram, you see kind of going up to the side this way, we look at money. Oh, I realize I'm backwards in Zoom, so don't pay attention to my hands. We've got money on kind of going in one direction over to the right, and then mission going over to the left side. We see positive impact, negative impact in terms of mission, and then with money, cost money versus generating money. Now, oftentimes people would say, with Funding Forward, any way that we are making money is something that we want to pursue. But that's not the case at all. Again, it needs to have that missional focus, which is why I really appreciate what Mark says, that we want to be staying in this green category. You'll notice that the thing that ties all of these green categories together is that they have a positive missional impact. There will always be things that our church does that costs money, but because it has a positive missional impact, we still are going to continue doing that. There will be things that break even, but because they have a positive missional impact, we'll keep doing it. And of course, there will also be things that generate money. Or if you don't have this now, you might consider adding something that not only has a positive impact, but generates money. Now you'll notice down here in our neutral section, even something that's mission neutral but generates money, Mark would say we should proceed with caution. And for these other categories on the bottom, these are things we want to stop doing or not even start doing. So let me give you an example of how this works. So in 2021, Luther Seminary invited a group of congregations to come together and explore Funding Forward in a learning community. And one of those congregations is located in Chicago. It's an Episcopal congregation located in the urban center. And they had been approached by a company who puts in EV charging stations. And they asked to put these charging stations in their parking lot. And when they first came into this learning community, they were ready to go on that EV charging station piece. They knew that it could make some money and they just wanted to make it happen. But I encourage them to take a step back. Is EV charging stations really a part of your mission? Tell us more. So they spent some time soul searching with their vestry, sitting down with their vestry, talking amongst their leadership. And at first they thought, well, I think it's at best mission neutral. So maybe we could proceed with caution. But as they did some more discerning of what God was calling them to do and to be, they actually realized that there was a positive impact here in two ways. One, the church really cared about care for creation. So the sustainability aspect was an important part of their mission. The other side of the equation was they kept thinking about what is going on in the parking lot. When people are sitting there, people who would never come into our church, this might be an opportunity for pastoral care, and it may also be an opportunity for evangelism. So they saw a positive missional impact. And as they did more research with EV charging stations, they realized that actually in the beginning, they'd be more like breaking even. Maybe near the end, they might be generating some money. But either way, they were still staying within the green quadrants. So they decided to go forward with it, knowing that that money and mission connection was there. So next, I want to take a look at what this looks like. What are some examples of what a sustainable model could look like? I'm going to share with you an example of a campus ministry, a congregation, and a pastor specifically who've tried this on. So first, we're going to begin by talking about Pres House. This is where Mark Elston, who put together that money and mission matrix, is from. His first call was actually here at Pres House in Madison, Wisconsin. And their mission statement, I'll read to you in just a moment, but I want to share their story first. So Pres House was at a really interesting point in time when Mark and his wife came to do their ministry there. Pres House had been underutilized. It was the only Presbyterian campus ministry on the campus, but it really lost its identity. It had been an interfaith center, it had been a cafe, it had been a couple different things, and people really didn't know what Pres House was all about. And honestly, they were being fully funded by the presbytery. And so when Mark and his wife came in, they really charged them to say, is it time to close? Is it time to sell? They had really great property right in the center of the campus at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So they needed to make a big decision. And as they listened to the different stories that were coming out, they realized that these students were longing for community, and particularly students that had struggled with substance abuse were really longing for a place that was dry or tobacco-free. And so they decided to use some of that campus property that they owned, take a small portion to be the chapel space, and the rest of it to build a unique apartment complex that included some different hallways and spaces that were substance abuse free, that were tobacco free, that were alcohol free, whatever that might be, a sober living community. And it really allowed them to meet people they would never have met through their traditional chapel services. So the mission of Pres House now is a dynamic campus ministry, a church led by students, and a unique apartment community in the heart of the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. So let's take a look at how they're funded. In contrast to when they started here in the early 2000s at Pres House, they are now almost solely funded on rental income. And then there's some individual gifts, some church gifts, some grants, and some other sources of income, as you can see there. I think what's fascinating about this is, number one, campus ministries, just like other ministries, cannot be funded on tithes and offerings alone. So they really had to do a funding forward model. And number two, this really freed up the presbytery to be able to support other things. And funny enough, the way they got a lot of this startup funding was from the presbytery. They actually asked the presbytery to bring in money that had been set aside in investments and invest it in this rental income project. And then they would pay the presbytery investment dividends. So a really, really interesting impact investment story. So the next one that I would look at is Haywood Street Congregation. They are in Asheville, North Carolina. And Haywood Street was started by a pastor who was particularly passionate about serving the unhoused in Asheville. And he had a really vibrant ministry idea. This is their mission: created with and for the most marginalized within Asheville, with the mission of relationship above all else. Haywood Street provides worship weekly, a clothing closet, a community garden, a free community lunch, and a place where people experiencing homelessness can stay for a short time to continue healing after being in the hospital. Now, as you might imagine, this example, of course, they were never going to be able to be funded by tithes and offerings alone. There was no way, with mainly unhoused people in their pews, that was going to be able to happen. So they decided, I think very smartly from the beginning, to take on more of a nonprofit model, that they would be inviting in donations from people who would never darken the doors of Haywood Street, but who cared about the unhoused in Asheville. So this is how they are currently funded. Currently, they receive 59% of their budget, or at least they did in 2019, from individual donors. They also receive funding from the United Methodist Church and partner churches. They receive some money from grants, including some federal grants for certain programs, and then some special event and other types of funding. The last example that I'll share with you comes from Free Range Priest. Now, it's important to note, Free Range Priest is a person, not a business or a church. The Free Range Priest is Father Kathy Camino, who's part of the Episcopal tradition. And Father Kathy was particularly passionate about part-time ministry. Now, some of you, I'm sure, will chuckle along with this. You know that oftentimes when ministers are serving part-time in a call, there is a clear expectation that these ministers will be there every Sunday, will be there at every council meeting, will continue to do the same amount of pastoral care as a full-time person. So you end up working a full-time pastoral job for a part-time salary and benefits, which can be a really, really tough spot to be in. And Father Kathy was really discouraged by this reality and decided to start a business for herself, where she not only modeled good part-time ministry, where she did contract work for congregations, but also teach others how to do this. And this is how the contracts work. She goes to a congregation and asks their lay leadership what they need. They might decide, Father Kathy, we want to hire you for 2 Sundays a month to preach a sermon and to stay after for the coffee hour and contract for a certain number of pastoral care hours per week. And of course, that contract can change from week to week as well. Father Kathy often likes to joke that she doesn't even have keys to the congregations that she is serving. And she's certainly not the one sitting at the head of the table in those leadership meetings. So let's see how she funds herself. Now, note, she's not just funding herself on congregations, she's also teaching others to do this work. She does teaching for 50% of her time. She does church services, and I believe at the time this budget was put together, she was working at 3 separate churches under contract. She does coaching, website design, book royalties, and some writing as well. So now I'd love for all of you to put in the chat as I continue on with the presentation. If you've tried some of these different sustainable models, maybe you've tried gaining income in a certain way, maybe you've experimented with reducing your budget, put in the chat what you've tried. I would love to hear more about it, and we can chat more about it in the Q&A time. So the last thing I want to share with you before we jump into a robust time of Q&A is, where do you start? If you're sitting here today saying, Grace, I've got a lot of ideas, I'm exploding with ideas of what I might start with, but I'm not sure where to go with all this energy. Here's what I would suggest. I would also say that these steps don't have to be done in a specific order. You can do them out of order. 1, spend time discerning what God is up to in your community and where God is calling you next. I realize that sometimes that can feel like an amorphous concept. How do we discern what God is up to? And oftentimes where I suggest that people start, if you're looking for a hook to start with, is look for love. We know from the Bible that God is love. Where is God at work in our community? Where do we see love in action? To me, I believe stewardship is love in action. So where do we see love arising out of our church budgets? Another word that one of my colleagues in ministry at Luther Seminary likes to point to, Reverend Dr. Michael Bender, likes to point to the word hope. Where do we see hope? Where do we see hope and love when we look at our budgets? Where do we see hope and love as we look at our communities? Where do we see hope and love as we look at our congregations? Where are those fruits of the Spirit present? And sometimes that can help us to name God's action if we're uncomfortable with that. We might also look, does the budget align with the mission? Really taking the time to put the mission and the budget side by side and seeing what we see. You might ask yourself, what assets are currently untapped? And what are the needs of your community? And how might those untapped assets and the needs of your community begin to meet one another? Now, I realize at this point in the presentation, you might say, Grace, I've heard of congregations doing this work, and oftentimes they're either making this decision because of a budget shortfall, or they're a congregation that has a lot of space that can be repurposed, and we are not that congregation. Are you sure this work is really for us? So I want to walk you through one of the congregations that I have worked closely with. This is Tree of Life in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Tree was my congregation up until 2 months ago when I moved to Gig Harbor, Washington. So it has a close place in my heart. Tree of Life is a very small community. It's bobbed up and down as many congregations have during the pandemic. It was a new start congregation in I believe in 2017, 2018. So they are still very new. And the pandemic kind of set back their course of growth. At their highest point, they were about 30 people. And during the pandemic, at times we were down to about 15. So as you can imagine, this is a small congregation. We intentionally don't own any property, so we're renting out space. So again, if you thought this seemed to be a large congregation with lots of property, let me show you how it works in a different type of context. I want to bring you into Tree's mission. Tree's mission is to cultivate faith community for people who have loved a church that has not always loved them back, to celebrate and create contemplative liturgy within the broader Christian community, and to wrestle with how to love God and serve our neighbors daily. So how exactly did Tree sample with Funding Forward? And this is an in-process story. This is not something that has a finished product. One of the first things that we did is we took some time to discern our mission. I was doing a project for the Lake Institute's Executive Certificate on Religious Fundraising, which I thoroughly recommend, where I needed to do a project in my context. And so I asked my pastor if I could talk to 10 different people in our congregation who give generously, whether of their time or of their money. And I interviewed them. We sat down for Zoom conversations, and I asked them why they give, what about Tree stands out to them, what they thought God was calling us to do and to be, what their favorite stories of Tree was, where they saw love and hope. And that allowed us to kind of bring together a rough draft mission statement from across these 10 conversations that we then brought back to the community for their response, and then polished with our leadership team and recently approved just a few meetings ago. Across this process of discerning our mission, we began looking at our budget. And one of the things we noticed is that we were investing a lot of money in space rental. And because we were stepping away from renting space during the pandemic, it became even more obvious to us how much money was being spent there. We had originally thought when we rented out this space that we would have more connection with the community. And what we found is it really wasn't fertile soil to create community relationships. So we decided to go around to different areas in the Minneapolis area to see where we wanted to be next and to see where we could find not only a cheaper rent, but a missional connection. And we eventually found a co-working space that was eager to host us during a time when most of the co-workers weren't there. So we were able to utilize their space. It was very flexible for our needs, and it gave us an opportunity to connect with other entrepreneurs. And since this is a congregation of mainly millennials and Gen Zers, many of whom actually work in the tech industry, this was a really fun connection for us. We also realized that many in our congregation, not just our musicians, were musically and artistically inclined. So we decided to gather those assets together and as a community to create a liturgy called Brightness and Shadows, which is a liturgy for Epiphany. It's beautiful. And in creating Brightness and Shadows, we actually received some grant funding from a congregation in our area who had the stipulation that we give this liturgy free and available to all those in our Minneapolis and St. Paul ELCA synods or ELCA area, and that beyond that, we could sell this liturgy. So it also became a small income source for the congregation. We also decided after the success of that grant experience to seek out additional grants for new projects. We are currently exploring outward-facing fundraising opportunities because we are a pretty young congregation, as you can see from that picture, and many of the ELCA churches in our area don't have many young people there. We're looking to find other congregations and other people who might be passionate about the future of the church who would partner with us to fundraise and offer funds, even if they don't ever become a part of the Tree community. And the last thing that we're looking at is evaluating staffing. Currently, we had an 80% time pastor, and she stepped away around the same time I did. So it gave us a chance to say, is this something we still need? Might we be a lay-led community? Might we be a place where we want a bivocational minister, or someone on contract? Or might we want someone full-time and step up to that place and maybe bring additional income into the congregation? It really gave us a point of change to be able to ask some good questions. And the last thing I'll share before we open up for Q&A is about the research project that I am currently in. I mentioned to you a little bit ago that we had done a learning community of 12 congregations who wanted to do funding forward work. And that Chicago congregation I mentioned with the EV charging stations was a part of that. And during that learning community, over the course of 1 year in 2021, we studied together with a lay person and a clergy person from each context. And they were so excited by this topic. They immediately understood why it was important. They were eager to get going, and the ideas that they had just could fill an entire wall. We could have a collage full of ideas for how to generate income or reduce their budget. But we found that where these congregations tended to hit the wall was around what conditions are necessary for a congregation to shift its economic model. They wondered if there were any conditions they had to have in place to move forward with this work, and particularly what practices they could use to facilitate change. They often ran into questions and boundaries and different rules and needing to get the congregation on board that was really challenging for them. And so figuring out what some of these practices are important. So as I mentioned, we're currently surveying 200 congregations. Of those, many are United Methodists, to hear more about how they have done this work and the conditions and practices they've used. And then we'll dive deeper into the interview process with them. Our hope is to use that research to share with the wider world how this work is being done so that you can learn and potentially create resources as well. If you're interested to stay in touch and hear more about the work we're doing, you can find out more at faithlead.org by signing up for our newsletter, the Stewardship Leaders newsletter, under the resources section. If you click that drop down, you can check the box to sign up for the Stewardship Leaders Program. Faith Lead is an exceptional resource for Christians of all denominations, and we would love to have you as a part of that community. So without further ado, I would love to dive into some questions. I would love to hear the questions that are coming up for you, and also to take a look at that chat box and see some of the things that you have been sharing and some of the things that you have tried in your communities. Oh, I love all of the links that you've been putting in the chat, Kim, around ministry and money and the grants that you're offering. Wow, this is exceptional.
Grace, if you don't mind, I could ask a question.
That'd be
Um,
great.
You talked some about repurposing church buildings. I know a lot of churches around our conference have more building than they need for the community, and yet there are community needs, but the building would have to be repurposed somehow. Can you address ways that a congregation might be able to do that?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that question up, Jeff. I actually just got an email from a congregation with that exact question a few days ago. They said in their situation that they had about $500,000 in repairs and that there was no way all of the people from that congregation might be able to fund it. So a couple of things that I brought up to them. The first thing that they could certainly do is look outside for grant funding. Partners for Sacred Places is a great place to look, particularly if you have a historic property. This is a great place to look. And also there actually is some national funding for historic places. So if you have a historic property, you may be able to get grant funding, and that could certainly be a head start for you. The congregation had mentioned a capital campaign. I know sometimes that can be an option, but in their case, they were just too small. So I'll continue down the line. One of the other ideas, and this is coming out of a book that I really appreciate on this topic by Mark DeMaz and Harry Lee, and I'm going to get the name wrong, Kim, so if you put it in the chat, I apologize. That's all about the coming revolution in church economics. And their idea was when they actually repurposed the warehouse space that they purchased, they brought in renters right away. And part of the renter stipulation was that they contribute to repurposing that property. So they brought in a gym to a space that was not set up to be a gym and said, we're going to give you a discount on rent for your first couple of months, knowing that you are going to be the one repurposing that space. Similarly, on the other side of the equation, you might also decide to rent out one piece of the property that's ready to go. It doesn't need repurposement, and use the rental income that you receive from that segment to fund the next section that needs to be repurposed and kind of do it piecemeal along the way. So those are just a couple of ideas to get you started. But as you can see, even if you're in a place where you don't know how you're going to fund it, it's not a dead end road. And I'd also say, of course, selling pieces of your building is an option as well. But I know in many cases, the church wants to be able to keep that property. So I see some questions.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Jeff. I see some questions coming in. Do you have any advice for beginners that need to learn how to apply for grants? And are there specific writing skills needed? That's a phenomenal question. And honestly, I would say you probably have a great resource here in the staff that are on our webinar today, particularly if they are offering different grants, they might have tips as well. I usually share with my classes an interview that I did with some grant writers. And funny enough, what they often said was, it's not as hard as you think. The biggest thing is that you actually have to answer the questions. Most of us who are in faith communities love to talk in flowery language. We love to share the mission of our place. We love to share stories and ideas, but we don't often answer the actual questions that are on the table. So it's really important that you focus on the answers to the questions. It's very important for many grantors that you're explicitly clear on how the money is going to be spent and the plan that you have in action. So one of the grant writers I've talked to has said you should actually start with your budget for the project and then move backwards, really to be clear about that budget and how it connects to your purpose statement as an organization. And oftentimes, grantors are really concerned with how this project will be funded after you get it off the ground. Grants tend to be really great for getting projects off the ground, not sustaining them over time, unless you're able to get federal funding, in which case then you might have a longer term funding source. So it's really important that you say, we really just need the startup capital, because at the end of the day, in 2025, when this money runs out, we're hoping to fund the project in this way. So then it feels like it has a sustainable legacy. So hopefully that's some help in getting you started there. And I also see another anonymous question. Do you have any experience with interdenominational or interfaith congregations who have merged facilities to share facility costs? Yes, I do. Absolutely. So there are two that are included in our research project. One that I know more about than the other. The one that is interdenominational is called Springhouse Ministry Center in Minneapolis. And I promise I'm not just bringing them up because they're in Minneapolis. They're doing exceptional work. And it is a Lutheran congregation that came together with the Disciples of Christ congregation, and I believe a UCC congregation. They came together. They actually have 3 separate ministry spaces that are located in their one big congregation, and they change spaces periodically, so they're not all just using one space. And they also then run a nonprofit space rental out of there. And they have saved so much money by coming together. They repurposed one of their properties to create this larger space for them to do this ministry work together. And then they share one building manager who manages all of those rentals. Because oftentimes when churches take on that rental process on their own and don't have a building manager, it can be a really challenging process. Oftentimes this falls to the church secretary who may not have skills in that area. So it can be really challenging for them to do that work. And then the last example I bring up is an interfaith context. I don't remember all of the specifications, but they are included in our survey of an interfaith piece. I believe that it was a Christian congregation, it was a Jewish congregation, and then it was a Muslim congregation that were all brought together in one ministry space that they built out, I think, in rural Illinois, if I'm remembering right. And they share space as a community, and they also have marked out their own specific territory, but their biggest focus is on interfaith work. So instead of just being a place that offers many different worship services, they're collaborating on different goals. I would say what I've learned from Springhouse and from this interfaith example is that it's really important that congregations that are coming together to share space have shared ministry goals, and that you really are actually going to be saving money through the process. As I've worked with congregations, I've often found that they don't often want to run the numbers on how this will really work. And this especially comes into play with rentals when they want to price themselves under market value, because they believe it's a ministry, which I think is wonderful. But if you are hoping to make money off of that, you do need to run all of the numbers, not just how much does it cost for the lights to be on, but what happens when repairs need to be made? Do you want to add on a little bit to the rent each month? That way you have a budget for those repairs. What happens when facilities needs to come in to clean the space? Oftentimes, not all of those hidden costs are taken into account when that rental amount is put together. Now, you might say that's a lot for a pastor to need to put together on their own. You certainly may not be an entrepreneur yourself, and so that can feel really challenging. What I would encourage you to do in that case is actually to lean in to the support from people in your congregation who are entrepreneurs and business people, and to ask, what should I be thinking about? What should we be doing? Can you help us to price this? And that can be one of the most successful ways to actually tap into gifts that your congregation may never have expected, or that a person may not expect your congregation to be using. Great questions. I love these.
Keep asking. We have more questions?
I'd love to hear any more that are out there. And I love the example you shared, Kim, of the grant to a church. Oh, beautiful, of the nonprofit organization kind of being an incubator and then sharing services and paying a low rent to the church. There's plenty of ways to think creatively besides just charging rent. As you said, sharing services is a great way to go about it.
Any other questions for Grace? We have a few more minutes.
Grace, do you have any concerns that bringing in new income might impact the offerings from the church?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked about that. That's a question that I often get. I will say it's a bit of a mixed bag. I've asked some congregations that do have additional income sources, and sometimes it's impacted the offering, sometimes it hasn't. But the biggest thing that a person or a congregation rather can do is say where the income is going. So for instance, with that example from Tree of Life of the liturgy that my congregation put together, Brightness and Shadows, we talked right off the bat about where that income would go. And we decided that that income would actually go to pay the salaries or offset some of the salaries of our musicians. So people knew in our congregation, Brightness and Shadows isn't making so much money that suddenly we need no more offering in the offering plate. In fact, it's just offsetting by a small amount that musician's salary, and there's still even more to be paid there. I think we have to remember that most people are going to assume these income sources are making more money than they really are. If you're renting out your parking lot, as you know, there's going to be more cost there than people see. And so even if they see a line item for income, we have to let them know where that money's going and how much money we're really making so that people understand how the kind of different economic pieces of our congregation are working.
I think the way Kim asked the question, she was assuming that it would have a negative impact if it had an impact, but I wonder if it could possibly have a positive impact because the congregation sees that the church is actually doing something in the community.
Yes, it absolutely can.
Yeah.
Love that.
So questions going once, flip them in there. It's 8 o'clock. We want to be, lost the word I want, respectful of the time we said we would take. I don't see any more questions coming in. So I would say thank you to Grace. Thank you very much. I know that our attendees can't say thank you out loud because it's a webinar, but I'm sure that they would thank you as well. And we at the foundation thank all of those who attended. And please remember that you will be getting an email in a couple of days that will have a link to this recording. Everyone who registered will get that email, and all those links that we put in the chat, I'll include those in the email too. So you'll have those resources. If you do want to get to Grace's presentation right away, it is already posted on our website on a special page for this webinar, umfwv.org/funding-forward. So watch for that email. It'll have lots of resources for you. And always feel free to call the foundation to ask questions. We're always there to help. I do want to let you know that we will be having more webinars next year, at least a couple webinars like this. And we're also going to plan to have an in-person Academy of Faith and Generosity. It'll be our third in-person Academy. And when more information is available, any of that, we will send that information out. When we were planning our second one, it was scheduled, Grace, for March of 2020. So that one quickly turned to a digital academy, and I think you were part of that. So thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you if you have questions, and we'll say good night.